and welcome to the Mountebank History of Scotland series with your host, me, Daniel Downey. I'm a comedian based in Edinburgh. I am also a historian of Scottish history. I got my master's degree in Scottish history. And today's episode is all about the killing time of the 1680s. This was a period of British and Irish history whereby the government persecuted a religious minority within its own borders. Very, very difficult to picture the UK government getting up to anything like that. I know, right? The term killing time was coined by the Covenanting historians, and it refers to the persecution of dissident protesting Presbyterians who refused to adhere to the 1681 Test Act that demanded their loyalty to King Charles II. If you did not pass the test and prove your loyalty to King Charles, let's say, for example, you moved to Los Angeles and you wrote a dogshit autobiography denouncing your entire family, then King Charles, he would get his brother onto you. And King Charles getting his brother onto you was as terrifying a thought in the 17th century as it is in the 21st century. It is presumably why Meghan and Harry moved to Los Angeles in the first place. Now, King Charles II's brother was, of course, James, the Duke of York, and acting as Viceroy of Scotland, James ordered the persecution of dissident protesting Presbyterians. Although, in truth, the so-called killing time was less a period of indiscriminate killing by the government and more a tit-for-tat terrorist campaign in which the government responded to civil terror with its own state-sponsored terrorism. Again, very difficult to picture something like this happen in the United Kingdom. I know, right? In truth, only 78 people were actually killed in the so-called killing time of the 1680s. That's enough for it to be remembered. The killing time in Scotland. In the United States, that would be considered rookie numbers. I mean, it's like an afternoon with a semi-automatic. The killing time provided Scottish history with some of its most renowned Covenanting martyrs and heroes. The men and women who stood up against the government and died for the Covenanting cause are remembered as great folk heroes to this day in many of the communities of lowland Scotland, particularly in the southwest of Scotland, where they have a strong tradition of standing up against the government. In the past, that was through organised guerrilla warfare. These days, it's mostly through voting for the Tories. Now, if this is the first time that you have listened to or watched the Mountebank History of Scotland series, this is the sort of thing that you should expect. It's Scottish history with lots of Tory bashing and jokes about the royal family. If that sounds like your thing, you're going to enjoy it. If not, I don't know, maybe the rest is history. I doubt they've done an episode in which they actively committed treason on an episode. Anyway, without further ado, here is your episode all about the killing time of the 1680s. I do hope you enjoy it. Have fun out there, and I'll see you all on the other side. Enjoy! After their victory at Drumclog, the Conventiclers mustered in an encampment near Hamilton at Bothwell Brig in the River Clyde. And over the next 3 weeks, thousands flocked to their cause from across lowland Scotland. It was an extraordinary gathering of Scottish people. Such a gathering of Scottish people was without parallel in Scottish history until we qualified for the Euros in 2024. However, just as had happened at Dunbar in 1650, instead of arming and drilling these new recruits, the Covenanters bickered over theology and the wording of the Rutherglen Declaration, which, if you remember from last week's episode, was the declaration the Conventiclers posted in Rutherglen outlining their grievances against the government and the supposed violation of the National Covenant. Deep, irreconcilable divisions developed amongst their ranks, and the old rivalries of protester and resolutioner developed amongst the Presbyterians. They were like Presbyterian Bloods and Crips. There were three distinct Covenanting factions. The most extreme were the Cameronians, named so because of their leader, Richard Cameron, a former field preacher. The Cameronians advocated the unrelenting pursuit of the Solemn League, which meant Presbyterianism across the three kingdoms. They refused to accept an uncovenanted government or to work with anyone who they deemed to be not godly enough. They believed that those ministers who had been pardoned by Lauderdale's indulgences of the 1670s were the greatest traitors of all, and they did not want their inclusion in the army or church or governance going forward. The Cameronians were by far and away the most famous and the most extreme of the Covenanting factions, but they weren't the largest and were in fact probably the least significant. The second group and the largest group were led by a preacher from Dumfriesshire, John Welch. Welch was the great-grandson of John Knox, and he had taken part in the Pentland Rising, but he was able to escape the battlefield at Rillington Green and become a renowned and outlawed field preacher with a price in his head. The Welch faction, they were prepared to accept the indulged ministers back into the fold, and they prepared their own version of the Rutherglen Declaration, which they nailed to the Mercat Cross in Hamilton on the 13th of June. The third and the smallest faction of Protesting Presbyterians was led by another legendary field preacher, John Blackadder. Blackadder was one of the displaced ministers of 1662. He was also an outlawed field preacher with a price in his head, and he had fled to Holland and only returned to Scotland in 1679. But Blackadder, he advocated only passive resistance against the church reforms. Basically, what happened at Bothwell Brig was everyone gathered for the same cause, but infighting made success completely unattainable. The largest group in the field, the SNP, they were passive and disinterested in actually delivering on what they promised, and mainly just wanted to be the largest group in the field. The second faction, the Alba Party, they wanted to remove all the transgender folk from the army. And the third party, or the third faction, the Green Party, they were mostly upset that the gathering at Bothwell Brig was upsetting the nesting habits of the local thrush and swallow populations. Together, their numbers may have been impressive, but collectively they were completely and utterly fucking useless and stood absolutely no chance of success or on delivering on what they promised. As the Covenanting factions bickered, the government raised a more comprehensive army to deal with the conventiclers than the band of government dragoons who had lost at Drumclog. The government army was led by the Duke of Monmouth, Charles II's eldest illegitimate child. Monmouth had around 6,000 men. The Covenanters had similar numbers, although their men were untrained and very poorly equipped. On the 22nd of June, 1679, the conventiclers sent a last-minute delegation to negotiate a truce, but Monmouth refused and he attacked. For 2 hours, the conventiclers resisted bravely, but eventually Monmouth's men gained the upper hand and the battle quickly descended into a slaughter. Monmouth pleaded for clemency, but his men ran amok on the battlefield at Bothwell Brig, and it was at Bothwell Brig that John Graham of Claverhouse earned his Bloody Clavers moniker from the conventiclers, killing indiscriminately as he attempted to avenge his defeat at Drumclog. Monmouth had won a decisive victory at Bothwell Brig, but he was still unable to capture the most prominent Covenanting leaders, Cameron, Cleland, Welch and Blackadder. Around 800 conventiclers were killed and another 1,400 were taken prisoner, with many of them imprisoned in the infamous open-air prisons in Edinburgh, also known as the open-top bus tour, an unimaginable punishment. Although in truth, unlike in the aftermath of Rillington Green, Monmouth, he opted for clemency instead of repression. Those prisoners who agreed to sign a bond of good behaviour were released, but around 350 of them refused and they were deported to the colonies. 250 Covenanting prisoners drowned on the ship the Crown of London, which left Leith on the 27th of November 1679 and ran aground on rocks near Orkney. But aside from this horrific accident, after Bothwell Brig, there was no excessive hangings and no torture as they had seen after Rillington Green. Only 5 men, chosen at random, were hanged as a response to the murder of Archbishop Sharp, which we discussed on last week's episode. 5 random people were chosen to take the blame for everything. It's what we can expect from the COVID inquiry. Monmouth, he ordered another indulgence of the conventiclers and actually legalised conventicles as long as they took place indoors and in private residence. Monmouth's policy towards conventicles was very similar to the Scottish Government's alcohol policy. It's absolutely fine if you're indoors and nobody can see you, but don't you even think about having a can of dark fruits in the park. But this period of Covenanting toleration that we saw in Scotland in the 1670s, it wasn't to last. Charles II, he had seen the lack of success indulgences had had during Lauderdale's reign, and he wanted the Covenanters to be diffused once and for all. And so he recalled his brother James, the Duke of York, who had been sent to Holland in the anti-Catholic panic in England in 1679, to govern his northern kingdom on his behalf. In late 1679, James came to Scotland with the title King's Viceroy in Scotland, making him the kingdom's ruler on behalf of King Charles II. James's return, it marked the end of Lauderdale's and Monmouth's policies of accommodation of the Presbyterians and the beginnings of direct Stuart intervention. And James, he had absolutely no intention of compromising with the Covenanters. After the defeat at Bothwell Brig, the scale of Covenanting influence in Scotland reduced dramatically, with the movement unable to exert any influence outside of southwest Scotland. Exercising absolutely no influence in Scotland outside of Dumfries and Galloway, the Covenanters were like the Tory party. It was here where Richard Cameron, the leader of the Cameronian Covenanting faction, returned to Scotland in 1680 from Holland, determined to stir his followers into action. The violence of his preaching at the now vastly reduced conventicles, it alarmed moderate Presbyterians as much as it did the government. Cameron's followers were violent, angry, and extremist. It was like a gathering of the Reform Party. On the 22nd of June 1680, the anniversary of the Battle of Bothwell Brig, Richard Cameron declared that he was in opposition against both the government and the king. On the 22nd of June, Richard Cameron, with a handful of armed zealots that he referred to as society folk, he rode into the Ayrshire town of Sanquhar and nailed to the town's Mercat cross the Sanquhar Declaration, which stated, "As the representatives of the true Presbyterian Kirk and Covenanted nation of Scotland, we for ourselves do by their presence disown Charles Stuart, that has been reigning, or rather tyrannising as we might say, on the throne of Britain these years bygone, as having any right, title to, or interest in the said crown of Scotland for government, as forfeited several years since by his perjury and breach of covenant both to God and his Kirk. We, being under the standard of our Lord Jesus Christ, captain of salvation, do declare a war with such a tyrant and usurper and the men of his practices as enemies to both our Lord Jesus Christ and his covenants." The Sanquhar Declaration, it was as extreme an anti-royal publication as Prince Harry's autobiography. But Richard Cameron, he was a man of strong passions but little education, and few had sympathy for him or his position, with most viewing the Cameronian movement as jeopardising the broader church of popular Presbyterian descent. Cameron's effective declaration of war against the king in the Sanquhar Declaration, it did not lead to the rising that he hoped for. Instead, it made him and his men public enemy number one. The Sanquhar Declaration, it was a political declaration made by a violent madman that nobody took seriously or paid much attention to. It was like Conor McGregor telling folk he's wanting to be a member of the Irish Parliament. On the 22nd July 1680, a detachment of around 120 government dragoons caught up with Cameron and around 60 of his men at Aird's Moss and Muirkirk in Ayrshire. What followed was a brutal battle in which the Cameronians acquitted themselves well, but in the end they were overrun and Cameron was killed. Cameron, he is often referred to as the Lion of the Covenant, in much the same way that Boris Johnson is often referred to as the lying cunt of Brexit. But Cameron, he was never the leader of a popular or serious uprising, and his attempted rebellion, it was a disaster. But then again, when you're led by a Cameron, things, they do tend to go pear-shaped. And people, they mostly focus on that time that you stuck your dick in a dead pig's mouth. The government, they inevitably caught up with and liquidated the Presbyterians. But Cameron's declaration of Sanquhar denouncing the king, it remains a spectacular act of defiance that has ensured Cameron has remained one of the most famous Covenanters, and his legendary folklore status was cemented by his heroic death at Aird's Moss. Many of the Cameronian prisoners who were captured at Aird Moss were taken to Edinburgh and subjected to torture, some of them using the boot. This was basically just a big iron cast boot into which iron wedges would be hammered into the narrow openings of the boot to crush the victim's foot. Wedges being forced into a boot It's like me trying to get my golf clubs into the back of my Vauxhall Corsa. James, in his role as Viceroy of Scotland, was present at many of the trials of the Cameronians captured at Erdmoss, and he was witness to their torture, often having to intervene to step in and demand that the torture stop when it became clear that no amount of torture was going to stop these men from denouncing the Covenant or the Sanquhar Declaration. It was like being asked to change phone provider. I personally would rather be tortured than have to get a puck code. There were in total 16 executions in the aftermath of Aird's Moss, but James was determined that there be no more Covenanting martyrs. James's most substantial and impactful response to Aird's Moss came not in the form of execution or torture, but through an act of Parliament, the 1681 Test Act. In 1681, the Scottish Parliament passed the Test Act. It was an act of Parliament that would dismay many of Scotland's highest-ranking nobles and mark the beginnings of much ill feeling towards James in Scotland, because no one here was remotely interested in watching Test cricket. The Act demanded that all office holders in church and state must uphold an oath of loyalty to the king and accept the monarch's royal supremacy in all matters both spiritual and secular. The king was the supreme governor of the church, and all of those in positions of power had to swear their allegiances to him and his heirs, and must renounce any attempts or intentions to change this system of royal authority, promising to never make any innovations, improvements, change anything in any way, and to love the king unconditionally. This remains the oath that members of Parliament have to take before they can take their seats in Westminster to this day. The consequence of the Test Act was yet another walkout of the Presbyterian clergy. In the Test Act's immediate aftermath, many of the indulged Presbyterian ministers who had returned to their parishes in the indulgences of 1669, 1672 and 1679, they left once again. In total, 63 ministers left their parishes, with most going to England or the colonies. The Test Act's biggest political victim was Archibald Campbell, the Earl of Argyll. Argyll refused to take the test. He was the country's first anti-vaxxer. Now, Argyll, he had been a royalist supporter and an ally of Lauderdale in the 1670s, during which time he agreed, albeit reluctantly, to put down and suppress conventicles in Argyll. But when Argyll was asked to take the Test Act oath, he quibbled over its wording, agreeing to take the oath only as far as it is consistent with the Protestant religion. His refusal to take the oath without qualifications, it infuriated James, and it led to his imprisonment in Edinburgh Castle. James, he wanted to make an example of Argyll. His passive resistance, in James's eyes, threatened the validity of the Test Act, and it was felt that a severe punishment was necessary to deter others from doing the same. Basically, the king's brother wanted everyone to take the test and be happy about it. The equivalent nowadays would be forcing every kid in every school in the country to do the Duke of Edinburgh Award. The government, they were still fearful of armed insurrection, and Argyll's actions, it was felt, could spark others into action. And so this is why they wanted to punish him severely. Argyll, seeing what was coming, he was able to escape from his imprisonment in Edinburgh Castle with the help of his stepdaughter Sophia. On the 20th of December, 1681, Sophia, she was granted permission to visit Argyll at Edinburgh Castle, and when she did so, she snuck in servants' clothes, disguised her father as her servant, and Argyll, he was able to simply walk out of the castle gate dressed as his daughter's servant. Argyll, he was able to escape prison more easily than the Tate brothers. And I'm pretty sure that Donald Trump, he'd have been happy to have pardoned Argyll as well. Well, I mean, until he found out about the cross-dressing thing. He wouldn't like that one, but Argyll, he escaped to Holland, where he plotted a rebellion against James, which we'll discuss on the next episode. And while he was away, he was tried in absentia and sentenced to death for his apparent treason. Now, most of Scotland's nobility, they believed Argyll's trial to be farcical and his sentence extreme at the very least. James, he had used the Test Act as a kind of crude weapon to test men's opinions. And as a result, it forced out not just the indulged ministers, but also many of Scotland's leading and most important office bearers. James's implementation of the Test Act and his treatment of Argyll demonstrated just how harshly he was willing to treat high-ranking members of the nobility. And if James was willing and able to do this in his role as Viceroy in Scotland, they started to wonder what he might do if and when he succeeded to the throne. It was a pre-warning. James had demonstrated just how bad a leader he could be before he would eventually go on to take over the running of the entire country. It was like Boris Johnson's time as Mayor of London. By the spring of 1682, James felt that he had accomplished what he had set out to achieve in Scotland, that is, the suppression of the Covenanting resistance in Scotland, and so he returned to London to resume his place on the Privy Council. James, he had spent a minimal amount of time in Scotland and now returned to London, happy that he knew everything there was to know about Scotland and could confidently interpret and understand its people despite interacting with absolutely none of them. He was like 99.9% of students who attend Edinburgh University. James, however, was still able to exert full control over the Kingdom of Scotland through a secret committee of the Privy Council. The King's brother, he just cannot resist a secret wee inappropriate relationship to himself. In 1682, James appointed James Drummond, the Earl of Perth, to the position of Lord Chancellor of Scotland, and his brother John Drummond, the Earl of Melfort, to the position of Treasurer and later Secretary of State of Scotland. Between them, the Drummond brothers effectively ruled Scotland in James's name. And through the Drummond brothers and the secret committee of the Privy Council, James was able to directly influence policy in Scotland from Whitehall. It was like the 17th century version of VAR. James, he may have been in complete control of Scotland, but his reign, it was dependent on a succession of placemen and puppets put in positions of power, usually after their rapid conversion to Catholicism. Both James and John Drummond had converted to Catholicism to assume their positions and to accelerate their careers, ruling through a succession of placemen ultimately answerable to London. I mean, thank God our political system has moved on since those days in Scotland. Scotland, it was reeling with the effects of the Test Act. Bands of government dragoons were roaming the countryside, demanding that anyone and everyone take the test. And so this, along with all these kind of placements of powerful Catholics in high positions of government in Scotland, meant that there was a queue of powerful magnates waiting for their moment to exploit any weakness that James or the Stuarts showed. And so the question remained, just how real would James's authority in Scotland be if it was seriously tested? And so from where or from whom was this test of James's authority in Scotland likely to come from? It wasn't likely to come from the Cameronians, considering that they had never really posed much threat in Scotland to begin with, especially after the death of their charismatic leader, Richard Cameron. The Cameronians were a tiny minority that posed no threat whatsoever, and yet the government still really liked to get all worked up about them. The Cameronians were like the trans people of the 17th century. But the Cameronian movement had found itself a new leader in 1680, Donald Cargill. Donald Cargill was a revered Covenanting reverend who had been injured at Bothwell Brig and escaped to Holland in the battle's aftermath, returning to Scotland in 1680 and preaching the sermon at Richard Cameron's funeral. Cargill, he was the natural successor of the Cameronian movement after the death of Richard Cameron. In the summer of 1680, he penned a document known as the Queensferry Paper, which acted as the kind of general manifesto of the Cameronian movement and a rallying cry for a fresh Covenanting rebellion in Scotland. If Richard Cameron was the Ron Hubbard of the Cameronian movement, then Donald Cargill, he was the guy who penned the kind of Presbyterian version of Dianetics. The Queensferry Paper outlined the guiding principles of the Cameronian movement, which was the rejection of prelacy, the rejection of royal supremacy over the church, the rejection of the indulged ministers, the rejection of arbitrary power over church and state, and the mutual obligation of all covenanters to uphold these principles through armed struggle. There was a lot of rejection, basically. The Cameronians were like the original incels. At Torwood near Falkirk in September 1680, Donald Cargill stamped his authority and leadership upon the Cameronian movement with a declaration denouncing the entire administration of Scotland, including the King and the Duke of York. A price of 5,000 merks was placed upon Cargill's head, and he was eventually captured in a surprise raid at the house of one of his supporters at Covington Mill near Lanark in July 1681. Cargill was taken to Edinburgh, where he was tried for treason and hanged at the city's Mercat Cross. His head, it was displayed above the Netherbow Port, the entrance to the city, a grim warning to any budding Covenanters who might wish to take Cargill's place at the front of the Cameronians. Cargill was yet another Covenanting martyr, and far from being dissuaded by his grisly death, the Cameronians, they stepped up their efforts after his execution by moving their operations underground and vowing to embark on a program of systematic murder and ambush. They organised themselves into praying societies, officially the least likely place to get laid at university. These societies, they were tiny in number. Never more than a few hundred were ever present at their meetings. But after Cargill's death, they were fired up. And in January 1682, the praying societies banded together to create an organised underground resistance network known as the Union of Correspondence Societies, who carried out targeted ambushes and assassinations of government dragoons and attempted to free Covenanting prisoners. In January 1682, the societies nailed their defiant manifesto, the Queensferry paper, to the Mercat Cross in Lanark, reaffirming their denouncement of the King, James the Duke of York, and the entire government of Scotland. To combat these societies, James Claverhouse was made Sheriff of Wigtown, Dumfries, Kirkcudbright and Annandale, and he was given extraordinary powers of stop and search in Dumfriesshire, which, according to the Covenanting histories, he used to brutally suppress the people of southwest Scotland, carrying out a range of atrocities against the Presbyterian population, regardless of proof of their involvement with the Cameronian praying societies. Although it should be noted that the extent to which this was actually the case has been challenged by modern-day historians, and far from being excessive in his repression of subjects in the Presbyterian southwest, Claverhouse is actually believed to have shown some amount of restraint in his attempts to flush out the societies. So basically, perhaps Claverhouse wasn't as much of a prick as everyone first thought he was. He's like the Mike Pence of the 17th century. In September 1682, the Cameronians found themselves another leader, a fiery teenager named James Renwick. Renwick was born in Miniiva in Dumfriesshire, and he had studied at the University of Edinburgh. And it was while he was studying at Edinburgh that he witnessed the execution of Donald Cargill. Renwick, he was inspired by Cargill's dignity and conviction during his final moments, and it sealed his resolve to become a part of the societies. In December 1682, he was sent to the Netherlands for theological training, and when he returned to Scotland in September 1683, he began field preaching, and his return, it gave the Cameronian movement the ministerial leadership it had lacked since the deaths of Cargill and Cameron. While Renwick was attempting to fire up the conventiclers in the southwest, the government stepped up its enforcement measures, not just of conventicles, but also of indulged ministers and veterans of past Covenanting battles. Anyone who had fought against the government at any point since the Restoration was rounded up and taken to Edinburgh for trial. The most famous or infamous example of this was that of the 80-year-old Captain John Peyton. Peyton had fought against Montrose at Kilsyth and Philiphaugh, and he had fought against Cromwell at the Battle of Worcester. And then after the Restoration, Peyton had fought alongside his fellow conventiclers at Rullion Green and at Bothwell Brig, at the time of which at Bothwell Brig he was 73 years old, which is mightily impressive and can only be matched by Mike Tyson, who'll still be fighting YouTubers at that age. Murdering an 80-year-old man from the west of Scotland was as pointless as it was excessive. I mean, the guy had already outlived the average life expectancy of the west of Scotland by about 20 years. Why not just wait for the inevitable? Living to 80 years old in the west of Scotland in 1684 was as impressive as living to 80 years old in the west of Scotland in 2025. You couldn't find a more committed covenanter than Peyton, and so his death, it created yet another covenanting martyr. So keen were the government to crack down on this underground covenanting resistance movement that in June 1684, Claverhouse, he left his own wedding party in Paisley to pursue a nearby conventicle. Leaving your own wedding party in Paisley to fight some Presbyterians. Now, usually in Paisley, that's a fight that would occur at the wedding. One of the defining moments of the killing time came on the 29th of July 1684 when a party of government dragoons were escorting covenanting prisoners from Dumfries to Edinburgh through the Enterkin Pass in Lanarkshire when they were ambushed by the Society men. A handful of soldiers were killed in the short skirmish and some of the covenanting prisoners were able to make their escape. But most of the ambushers were captured by an enraged Claverhouse who had them taken to Edinburgh, where they were then tried and hanged. In response to their killing, James Renwick, on the 8th of November 1684, he drew up the apologetical declaration and admonitory vindication of the true Presbyterians of the Church of Scotland. Now, obviously, normally, apologetical declarations, they're normally made after men ejaculate. But this particular apologetical declaration, it reaffirmed the Cameronian principles laid out in the Queensferry paper, and it was essentially a declaration of war against the government and all those who collaborated with them. Just 1 month later, the Cameronians, they assassinated 2 government soldiers as they were leaving a pub in Bathgate, and this was just one action in a series of systematic and targeted assassinations and murders. This was the final straw for the government. Enraged by the apologetical declaration and ongoing violence, the government stepped up its anti-terror response measures. An abjuration oath was drawn up which required all those when presented to formally denounce Renwick's apologetical declaration, but even those who passed this test, they could be sent to Edinburgh for trial and execution. Southwest Scotland, it was on a war footing. No one was safe. Anyone who did not take the abjuration oath to the satisfaction of the government representative could be legally put to death on the spot as long as 2 witnesses were present. Innocent men and women were shot for stumbling while taking the abjuration oath or for not taking it satisfactorily. The killing time, it had reached its most frenzied and brutal high point. 78 people are known to have been killed, many without trial and others in scuffles or escapes or for refusing to abjure. The parallels between the killing time and the troubles in Northern Ireland are obvious here, although it should be pointed out that in this case, the Presbyterians were against both the monarchy and the Pope, and disliking both the Pope and the monarchy, well, I mean, that would be considered actually pretty progressive these days. The Cameronians may have displayed an impassioned and impressive defiance of royal authority, but the societies, they were never a real serious test of royal authority in Scotland. However, this more serious test of royal authority, it was just around the corner. In 1683, another bizarre conspiracy theory was brewing in England, the Rye House Plot. The Rye House Plot was a scheme to kidnap and murder both the King and the Duke of York as they returned to London from the Newmarket races on the 1st of April 1683. The plot failed when a fire at Newmarket meant that the races were cancelled. I'm so impressed that they cancelled the races for a fire. I mean, nowadays, the Tories, they won't even let a worldwide pandemic stop them from betting on their ponies. The Rye House Plot, it was unlike the Popish plot concocted by Titus Oates, in as much as this one was real, and it had the backing of some of England and Scotland's highest ranking political figures. The most prominent figure involved in the Rye House plot was Charles II's eldest illegitimate son, the man who had put down the conventiclers at Bothwell Brig, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth. Monmouth, he had exiled to Holland in 1679, and it's while he was there that he is alleged to have directed the plot alongside the fugitive Archibald Campbell, the Earl of Argyll. Charles II, he came down hard on those he suspected of being involved in the Rye House plot, with torture once again used to extract information. Although there were few executions in Scotland connected to the Rye House plot, in its aftermath, many of Scotland's nobles who were sympathetic to the plot, they were nervous, and with good reason. By 1683, it was clear that Charles II's wife, Catherine of Braganza, would not bear children, and that the Catholic James, Duke of York, the Viceroy of Scotland, he was going to ascend to the thrones. James, he was ultimately the man that was behind the suppression of the Covenanters in Scotland throughout the 1680s, the so-called killing time, and now it was clear that he was going to become king. James, he had shown his resolve in putting down Presbyterian dissidents, and he would show just how capable he was in dealing with insurgents and plotters when he would become king in 1685. And it is the rule of King James VII of Scotland and James II of England and Ireland that we are going to talk about on the next episode of the Mountebank History of Scotland. So that brings us to the end of the episode on the killing time in 1680s Scotland. I do hope you enjoyed it and that you're enjoying the series in general. If you are and you met me in real life and you'd be like, Daniel, I'd love to buy a pint of beer, a cup of coffee, you can do that digitally. I've got Ko-fi and Buy Me a Coffee accounts. I'll put the links in the description to the video. Please like, subscribe, do all that stuff that folk ask you to do. Tell your pals. Let's kind of try and grow the channel if we can. That would be really, really appreciated. Give me a wee follow on social media as well. I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Mountebank Scotland. I normally just do like wee funny videos about Scottish history. I put out stand-up clips, all that sort of stuff as well. You can listen to this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast from. I started recording for YouTube episode number like 33, so obviously there's like 30 odd episodes that you can listen to that you can't access on YouTube, so check that out. And if you ever happen to find yourself in the wonderful city of Edinburgh and you would like to come on one of my walking tours, you can do that. Book via my website. Again, I'll put the link in the description. And I do a comedy walking tour of Edinburgh, basically. I take people around the city, I show them the sights, I try and make them laugh while I'm doing it. This is what this whole thing is born out of. I do that, and I also have a comedy whiskey tasting as well. You get 4 malt whiskies from Scotland. I talk you through the kind of history of whiskey distillation in Scotland and the kind of cultural relevance of whiskey to the Scottish people. So again, you can book both of those via my website, mountebanktours.com. I'll put the link in the description. And I think that's me plugged everything I need to plug now. I do hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you all next time round. Cheerio! Bye-bye!